I want to introduce to you Markus Flynn. Markus serves as the Executive Director of Black Men Teach, where he champions accessible and affordable pathways for Black men to become elementary educators. A dedicated leader in the Twin Cities community, Markus collaborates with partner schools, teacher training programs, and community organizations to recruit, prepare, place, and retain Black male teachers. Since joining Black Men Teach in 2021, Markus has driven transformative growth, expanding both program participation and financial resources by over tenfold. Under his leadership, the organization has forged innovative initiatives, including HBCU, Historically Black Colleges and University, to Minnesota Pipeline at the University of Minnesota, which offers Black male graduates of HBCUs fully funded master's degree in education. He also established a groundbreaking homeownership program in partnership with the Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, providing fellows with at least $30,000 in fully forgivable down payment assistance to support first-time home buyers. A recognized community leader, Markus received the General Mills and United Negro College Fund's Local Legend Award in 2022. In 2024, he was honored with the Outstanding Young Alumni Award from his alma mater, Iowa State University. Before stepping into his role at Black Men Teach, Markus pursued his passion for education as a 5th and 6th grade teacher in Minnesota. Man, bless you. He considers his connection with and impact on his students among his most meaningful professional achievements. In January of this year, Markus wrote an op-ed for the Star Tribune. I want to share just a little bit from that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Markus. Markus writes, "At the heart of the American dream lie three foundational pillars: home ownership, economic opportunity, and social mobility. There are countless quotes that highlight the transformative power of education, but one that has always resonated with me comes from George Washington Carver. Quote, "Education is the key to the golden door of freedom." End quote. If education unlocks the door to freedom, then home ownership is the key to unlocking the door to financial freedom. The interconnectedness of housing and education demands solutions that are just as interwoven. At Black Men Teach, we believe the American dream is possible for everyone, and that teachers are the locksmiths crafting keys for the future. Our role is to ensure someone is making keys for the locksmiths themselves. Please welcome Mr. Markus Flynn. I'll kill the lights here in just a second so we can see the slides.
And I'll talk for a little bit before you do it,
Okay,
so I'll let you know.
You bet.
So, Pastor Mike, I appreciate that. I realized I sent him the wrong bio. I sent you the one that makes me sound a little too good and get expectations too high. I meant to send a simple one just in case. But I appreciate that so much. Like you said, my name is Markus Flynn. I'm the Executive Director of Black Men Teach. I know I have until 11-ish.
Yeah, give or take. I've got to get out of here before 11.
Okay. So I have 45 minutes roughly to spend time with you all and put together a presentation that'll be kind of data heavy, but I like I like context. I really appreciate context. And so before I get into the presentation, I want to talk just a little bit about just some of my story and just some things I fundamentally believe. And so I'll start with this one. The first belief is there is a genius in simplicity. I have always been fascinated by this idea that you can go into a store and find a $15 t-shirt and it be sold for $50 just because you see a Nike logo on it. But that simple check mark is one of the most iconic symbols in the world. You know, in the early 90s, milk consumption started to go down as a function of soft drink consumption going up. And so the California Milk Processing Board went to do something different about it. They went to reverse the trend, so they brought in an ad agency. And most ad agencies would create an advertisement about the benefits of milk, right? Like calcium and more calcium. I don't know what else is beneficial in milk besides that. But this ad agency did something very different. What they did was they created one of the most simple and iconic slogans in marketing history, and it was "Got Milk." And I think about the work that I do. The work I lead at Black Men Teach is simple, and I appreciate it. There's genius in our name. Black Men Teach immediately conjures up some images in your mind that will just generally put you in the ballpark of the work that we do without knowing anything else outside of that. And so for me, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do the work that I do. And you know, when I say it's an honor, I truly mean it. The work that I do is actually my dream job. I struggle to think about things that I would prefer to do over what I'm doing right now. And I'm here today in a very non-traditional path. I came to the work that I'm doing right now because the greatest advice I could ever give and the greatest advice I'd have ever received is simple. I call it the coordinates for a meaningful life. It says that at the intersection of your passions and your talents lies your purpose. And so for me, that was simple. I did not go to school to be a teacher. I could not imagine myself being a teacher for most of my life. If you would have told me at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old I would be a teacher, I would look at you and say, you're crazy. Absolutely no way. But obviously I did. And you know, when I was in graduate school, I had my mentor tell me this. If you intersect your passion and your talent, that's how you find your purpose. And I remember being fixated on this idea of living a purposeful life. And so when I started to do this reflection about what I was doing in the world of epidemiology, I realized very early on, this isn't it, right? This isn't the place where I would do it. I thought it was because I thought at the time, health was the most foundational thing you have in your life. And I realized outside of directly practicing medicine, epidemiology, which is a longitudinal observational study for health, had the ability to influence policy. It could inform practice. And I thought that was what I wanted to do. So I was on this path to become a PhD level epidemiologist when I started that reflection. And fortunately, the research that I was doing in the health sector started pushing me towards education because I realized in the large health studies, they always control for education as a confounding variable, always. And I thought that was interesting because I didn't imagine in education studies they would control for health outcomes. So it started to shape this thing in my mind of thinking, education might be even more foundational than health. So I started looking into the studies. So one thing I will always do if I don't know something, I'll just look for the data. And what the data pointed me to was two of the most compelling studies I had ever seen. There's a study that said if a black student has one black teacher by third grade, they're 13% more likely to enroll in college. If you had a second one in that same time frame, that 13% goes all the way up to 32%. And the thing that I found really interesting about that study was they didn't say that these teachers had been trained at this university, or these teachers went through X professional development, or these teachers did this, utilize this curriculum. It was the immutable qualities that those teachers brought to the classroom that had an impact on their students that was significant. 32% more likely to enroll in college from having two teachers before or by the third grade. And so for me, the data gave me a very clear direction. I knew I needed to become a teacher. What I did not know was if I like kids. I had absolutely no idea. It had been a long time since I've been around kids at this time. I was like, well, you know, kids are people, so maybe I do. I like people. But once I decided to teach, the next question for me was where. And so I was open to going absolutely anywhere. My goal actually at the time was to go where I felt the work would be the most impactful. That was my guiding light. There is a caveat though. I'm doing a lot of this reflection and making these decisions in 2017. That's an important year. So if you remember 2017, that's the year of the polar vortex. And so I'm in Iowa at the time in grad school experiencing this polar vortex, and I made a promise to myself. I said, once I graduate, I will never see a flake of snow again. Will never see it, will never experience it. But in this effort to be thoughtful about where I began my career, I started to do research. And immediately I felt called to Minnesota, immediately. I remember seeing two articles. The first said, here are the best public education systems in the country. Number one, Massachusetts. Number two, Minnesota. From a non-education person, I'm like, okay, Massachusetts, I can kind of see it. You got the Harvards, the MITs, all of that. Minnesota, I was a little bit more surprised. So I look into Minnesota, and it feels like the very next article I saw said, biggest black-white education achievement gaps. Number 1 was Wisconsin. Number 2 was Minnesota. And I remember seeing that dichotomy, that high ranking on both of those lists, and I felt compelled. I felt like this was the place to go. And I started looking into Minnesota more, right? Because I believed the infrastructure for a strong education environment was there. It was evident by that high ranking on that study of best public education systems. But what I also noticed was there's this incredibly pervasive inequities that manifest explicitly in education. I felt like this was a place that you can close the gap. And so I started looking into things more, and then I saw something that you'll probably still see to this day. If you Google worst place to live if you're black, Minnesota was on the top 5 of every single list. And it's these compilation of these statistics where it's just looking at, we in this state of Minnesota have nation-leading gaps in a lot of the most important quality of life indicators. Education, health, housing, unemployment, wealth, all of those you will see nation-leading gaps. So with whatever website, every time I went down the list of Google, I saw top 5, every list. But still I felt called because I believed, and I still believe to this day, that of all of the quality of life indicators, education is the one that's the closest thing to a rising tide. It's the one that has the most residual benefits that creep into the other ones and starts to bring them up as well as that one increases. But it was June of 2019, which is 1 month before I was set to move here, that I actually started to question my decision. I had come across the name Justine Damon. For those who aren't familiar with Justine was this unarmed citizen who was wrongfully murdered by the police. She had called the police to report an assault that she thought was going on in the alley in her home. And when the police arrived, they checked out the scene. They didn't see anything. And so they got back in their car, but Justine had came out. And when she came out, she had made a noise that had startled the officers. And so both of them drew their weapons. Justine approached the driver's side window. The police officer who was in the passenger side aimed his weapon. He shot one time, hit her in the abdomen, ended up being a life-ending shot. And the reason this story stuck out to me so much was the timing. Justine was murdered just weeks after the police officer who had murdered Philando Castile was acquitted. And so in June of 2019, when I'm reading this article, the article says that the police officer, whose name was Mohammed Noor, became the first police officer in the history of Minnesota to be convicted of murder. And the reason this stuck out to me is because Mohammed Noor was a black male police officer who just witnessed the murder of Philando Castile on video. And the name Philando Castile even was a national name. I remember being an undergrad in college protesting it when this happened. And there was something about the timing that just sent this glaring hypocritical message to me. And the message to me really felt like a question of whose lives had value in a place like this. And I remember being in the kitchen at my home, reading this, thinking about moving to Minnesota and asking myself the question is, would my life matter here? Would it matter? And I remember feeling in that moment a very clear sense of fear. I was already aware of like the numerical disparities and how they manifested. I was aware of the quality of life, the education. I was aware of all of those things. But in that moment, I remember being scared to continue with the move here. But I came. And I came because I knew that at the core of this problem was a simple yet pervasive issue. And it's around narratives. And it's something that we're seeing right now in this moment, for sure. The problem with narratives, though, is that we have a tendency to believe that something is true simply because we hear it often enough, or we see it often enough, right? We probably all heard bats are blind. They're not. Probably heard that shaving will make your hair grow back thicker. It doesn't. And this one might be a little controversial. But we heard that sugar will make kids hyperactive. The science says otherwise. But in the context of my move to Minnesota, I realized that here and across the country, there are powerful and dangerous narratives that are at play. We have allowed ourselves to believe in narratives of difference that make it okay that some people succeed and others do not. We have allowed ourselves to believe that certain neighborhoods are dangerous because of the people who live there, rather than because of the economic isolation and the gutting of community resources. We have allowed ourselves to believe that mass incarceration is about justice rather than a system built to criminalize and target. We have allowed ourselves to believe that the wealth gap exists because some people work harder than others rather than because of generational theft. And so today, as I introduce this idea of Black Men Teach, I want to talk about a narrative that is at the heart of the work that we do. And it's this narrative around achievement and achievement gaps and achievement deficits. And so, thank you, Pastor. So I remember when I decided to move to Minnesota, this was a billboard that was on display. Minnesota schools are the worst in the nation for our children of color. And it was one that was really designed to bring attention to the conversation we're talking about now. And it was based on graduation rates. So in 2017, in Minnesota, we saw the lowest graduation rates in the nation for Black and Latinx students. At the same time, the lowest for both. So this was designed to bring attention. But the problem is, without context, we don't know who is at fault. Recently, I had got on LinkedIn and I saw this headline. Many of America's Black youth cannot read or do math, and that imperils us all. It doesn't take much time to spend, you don't have to spend much time on the internet to see headlines like this one, or this one. But the challenge with all of these headlines, the challenge with the billboards, is they lack context. The most important word, I believe, in the English language is 3 letters, and it's why. Also a complete sentence, why. And I think if we don't talk about the context, the why behind some of these things, it's easy to blame the people. It's easy to perpetuate a narrative of difference that puts a position where it makes sense to folk that we see these disparities and these differences in achievement. But in actuality, achievement is a manifestation of parameters that exist that set the foundation for that for the achievement to really manifest. And so I want to talk about some of the things that go into it. I want to start with this idea of education redlining. Pastor Mike had read from the op-ed I wrote, but housing and education are intrinsically linked. It's clear. And the history of housing has an impact on what we see in education today. So real quick history on the term redlining. So we know the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934, and it was explicitly designed to increase America's housing stock. And so what they did at the FHA was they would roll out these maps of major metropolitan areas. And then they would color code them and score the neighborhoods based on how desirable they were to live in. And what we saw was areas with predominantly Black populations were almost exclusively marked in red as these undesirable and unsafe places to insure a mortgage. And they were just justified as a way to reduce risky loans. So what do we see now when we think about the impacts of redlining? Well, we know that in the United States of America, the primary way to accumulate wealth is through home ownership. And so we see Black families were unable to secure housing loans due to those discriminatory practices and really robbed of that opportunity. And what we see today from a national level is this. The Black home ownership rate is 44% compared to 74% for white families. If we want to look at this from a Minnesota context, we actually see the largest gap for a major metropolitan area in the country. Instead of 44 to 74, it's 25 to 78. here in Ramsey and Hennepin counties. And what we see is when black folk were able to own homes, they were 5 times as likely to be in a formerly redlined neighborhood. Oops. And so what that means is they've generated significantly less wealth over time from those property value increases because of where those homes are. So to housing and education, education and redlining, right? Again, that relationship is intrinsically linked. The median value of a home near a high quality elementary school is 4 times as valuable as a home near a low quality elementary school. And for the vast majority of students across the country, where you go to school is really predicted by where you live. Even in a place like Minnesota that's open enrollment, 90% of students go to school in the community that they live in. And what do we see on a national level? Well, predominantly non-white school districts receive $23 billion less in funding. We know the primary way that schools get funding is through taxes, local property taxes. And so the impact that this has on the funding is here. 23 billion on a national level might not sound like that much, but when we think about it on a per pupil level, we're talking about 2,200 per student less per year. Significant difference, a significant difference. But again, when we're thinking about that academic achievement gaps, how often do we think about the historical impacts, redlining, discriminatory home ownership practices? And this, again, is from a national level, but we could talk about it from a Minnesota context too. There's a documentary called The Jim Crow of the North. It maybe came out in 2019, 2020, something around there, but it talks about Minnesota's history with racial covenants. If you go through Minneapolis, you'll see large majority of those homes have racial covenants in them. They said a lot of things, but every single racial covenant said you cannot sell this home to a black person. Might have added other groups in there as well, but everyone made sure that that one was clear. So here's some data right now. This gives us an idea of where black students attend schools. So black students are much more likely to be highly segregated schools as a function of these housing practices. And then also much more likely to attend high poverty schools. Again, it's a function of the same thing. There's a study from Brown University that really also talks about this same thing. They say districts and schools located in formerly redlined neighborhoods have less per pupil revenue, they have a more diverse student population, and they have lower test scores. And so I want to move into something else. I want to talk about this idea of discipline disparities. You know, bias against black students starts really early. And I say really early, I'm basically talking about as early as you can get into a classroom. This is a screenshot from a 2016 Yale study. And there were 4 children sitting around the table. On the left, you see there's 2 white students, a boy and a girl, 2 black students, a boy and a girl. And they told a group of teachers, watch this video of these preschool students playing with manipulatives, and we want you to identify misbehavior. Now there's an important caveat. There's absolutely no misbehavior going on at all, no misbehavior. But what they're doing is using the eye tracking software to see when teachers are given the assignment to identify misbehavior, where do they spend their time and attention? And the outcome of the study was very telling. When the teachers were given this assignment, unwittingly, what they did was they spent 42% of the time looking at the little black boy. And so what it shows us is there's this unconscious bias that exists, that when you spend more time looking for something, you're going to spend more time finding something. And the data tells us that as well. So this number here, 3.6, there was a 2014 Department of Ed report that shows black preschool students are 3.6 times as likely as their white peers to receive school suspensions. And so if we look at this graph, what it tells us is black students are about 18% of all preschool students. But the gray bar tells us they're 48% of all suspensions in preschool, 4 years old. So again, this bias starts incredibly early and it has legitimate impacts. You spend more time looking, you will spend more time finding. I tried to find the most comprehensive discipline disparity survey I possibly could. And this is what I got from the Government's Accountability Office. And basically, I'm not going to spend too much time on these charts and everything. Basically, what it tells you is no matter what type of discipline we're talking about, right? Out of school suspension, in school suspension, referrals to law enforcement, expulsions, corporal punishment, school related arrest. No matter the type of school, magnet schools, traditional schools, charter schools, alternative schools, special education schools, no matter the rate of poverty at the schools, low poverty, medium, high poverty, the outcome is the same. Black students are overrepresented in discipline relative to what you'd anticipate by how large of a student body population they are. But again, in the conversation, when we talk about academic achievement, who's talking about this? Who's talking about school being a trauma-inducing place because students are a target of discipline policies and procedures? There's even data that says that the difference in discipline isn't even necessarily due to a difference in behavior. I'll show you two studies. So this one says in Wake County, 40% of Black students caught with cell phones were suspended last year compared to 17% of white students, right? So more than twice as likely for the exact same offense to be penalized. Another study's looking at middle school students, and do you get a verbal or written warning before being escalated up the consequence ladder? And the same thing, they find Black students are less likely to receive forewarning before they receive a consequence. So more likely to be penalized, less likely to get a warning for it. It's a tough position to be in. Next, I want to talk about this idea of teacher expectations, because I actually think that this right here is one of the most important things in education that does not get talked about often. I actually wrote another op-ed on this specifically too to kick off this school year. It's a quote I like from Wes Moore. We're not products of our environments, we're products of our expectations. I think is very much true. So I try to make an argument for why I think that. So there's a study, I think it was done in 1968, that kind of established this thing called the Pygmalion effect in education. So a professor named Jim Rosenthal had 3 classrooms, went to those classrooms and told the teachers, hey, we did a test on all of these kids. And in each of your classrooms, there's this subset of students who have potential for unusual growth within this year. You got these outlier kids in your classroom. And of course, just like the earlier study, there's a caveat. Ain't nothing different about these kids. Absolutely nothing is different about these students. Comes back 8 months later at the very end. What does he find? Those students who are identified as having unusual potential for growth outperformed everyone else in their class. There was a New York Times article that came out about this professor, I think last year because he passed. And in that New York Times article, they said the kids also grew, it was like 37 IQ points, which I was like, that is unreal. That just it feels like unfathomable. And so I said, okay, I gotta find more data on teacher expectations and the impact it has on students. Because I'm like, there's no way 37 IQ points is possible. So I found this. This is a study from Corinne Visible Learning. It's a project called MetaX. And it was a professor who started thinking about 99 or 2000, trying to answer a simple question. What variable has the greatest impact on student achievement? Simple question. And he chose to look at meta-analyses. And for those who aren't familiar, meta-analysis is basically a single study that will take a bunch of studies and distill it into one variable. So you take one study, you might have 5, 10 studies, take all of what you learn from those studies and do one variable called an effect size. And he said an effect size of 0.4 right there in the middle is something that has the potential to have meaningful growth within a school year. So 0.4 is the number to think about. You see some of the things that fall to the right, some of the things that fall below. And so over the past 25 years, to answer the question, he's looked at over 2,100 meta-analyses, which comprise more than 132,000 studies and involve more than 300 million students from around the world. It's a lot of data, a lot of data. And he divides the categories into, call them 9 different domains. Here are the domains, right? Things related to students, things related to home, school, classroom, teacher, curriculum, student learning strategies, teaching strategies, out of school technology strategies, right? So he looked at 2,100 studies in all of these 9 areas that include over 300 million students. And this is what they found. So I went in there and pulled some things that I thought were relevant. Initial teacher initial teacher education program. So where did you go to college? Well, okay, I can see that having an impact. Effect size on that was 0.1. So where you go to college is not that meaningful. Okay, teacher subject matter knowledge.
And it's that number 0.4 or higher that we're looking at?
That's what we're looking for. 0.4 or higher means it has really meaningful impact. So I'm looking, okay, teacher subject matter knowledge. That has to mean a lot. 0.13, I'm like, okay, we're getting closer. What about professional development programs? What kind of training are they getting when they're in the classroom? 0.44, okay, that's meaningful. Hit that threshold of 0.4. Teacher clarity, how well can you communicate to your students? 0.85, very important, makes a lot of sense, very important. What about teachers' estimates of students' achievement? So really, teachers' belief in what their student can do. It's got to be meaningful, right? Very much so. 1.29, 1.3, almost 3 times, or over 3 times what that meaningful that meaningful cut point is of 0.4. The teacher's estimate of students' achievement, the teacher's belief in what their student can do, had a 1.29 impact. And so I went and I was like, okay, that's insane. Let me look at all of it. So I filtered the data to see everything that was above 1. Like, I need to see what are the most meaningful things. And this was the list that I came. There are only 6 things that were above that threshold. And what I found was important. There was only 1 that was higher than the teacher's estimate of students' achievement, and it was collective teacher efficacy. But even I thought that was interesting because the final column that I added here, robustness, is basically a measurement of confidence. It's on a scale of 1 to 5. And so if robustness is 1, it means there wasn't a lot of studies in the meta-analysis, which means if they added more studies, the likelihood of those additional studies influencing the actual number is great. So something like the jigsaw method where there's only a robustness of 1, that means if you added in 5 to 10 more studies, they feel like, based on the size that they have right now, that'll have a big influence on that. The only one with a robustness above 3 is teacher estimate of achievement, which means they're fairly confident that adding more studies in won't change the impact. So my conclusion based on this was, out of these 2,100 studies comprising over 300 million students, the one that has the most impact on student achievement based on this professor's research is the teacher's belief in their students, the teacher's expectations of their students, one and the same. And so I wanted to pull data and say, what does the data say about the expectations of Black students? Well, when you look at Black teachers compared to non-Black teachers are more likely to perceive students to be excessively disruptive, frequently inattentive, to not complete their homework. They're also less likely to expect black students to perform at grade level, graduate from high school, complete a 4-year college degree. And so when I started this expectation section, I started with this idea of the Pygmalion effect and what that could do in 1 year when your teacher really believes in you. Imagine the damage that low expectations do over the course of an entire K-12 career. We have a saying at Black Men Teach that black boys will drop out in 5th grade but walk out in 10th. Just thinking about how early you can get disengaged and the impacts that has on your long-term tenure in a K-12 setting. So what's the solution? Well, I think one of them is simple. And it's part of what I open with. Black teachers just have a tremendous impact on black students. It's just that simple. I wholeheartedly believe that there's no program, policy, or professional development that's more influential in the success of a black student than having a black teacher. And I think it's simple. I think the data really says that. You see, when black students are in a classroom led by a black teacher, they're held to higher expectations. You see decreased likelihoods of students being suspended, increased likelihood of being enrolled in a talented and gifted program, increased daily school attendance. You even see increased standardized test scores. And in the elementary school setting, which is where our organization focuses, you see tremendous long-term impacts. Back to the study I had mentioned in the beginning that really made me become a teacher, 13% more likely to enroll in college if you have one black teacher by the 3rd grade. You had a second one is 32% more likely. There's a study saying that black students are 29% more likely to graduate high school. In that same study, they looked at low-income black boys. So a group that the data will tell you is one of the hardest to reach. And they saw a black student having one black teacher between 3rd and 5th grade, and it's a black boy who's on free and reduced lunch all of his K-8 career. He's 39% more likely to graduate high school just from having that one teacher. This to me is life-changing data. It's the reason that I switched my entire career. I had the vision of being in Atlanta, working for the CDC at this point, but instead I'm doing this work here because I fundamentally believe that this work is really life or death. It's that important to me. And there's even data that says black teachers will make their colleagues better. This was a recent study that came out and it said black students in classrooms led by novice white teachers that have a black teacher on their grade level. You see those black students perform better in math and are less likely to be suspended. And so this is actually an image from when I used to teach. These are my former students. This is from my 6th grade science class. And I think about these kids often. It really just reminds me of how important this work is. The girl who's right here in the middle, she's one of those students who's considered like a behavior problem. I remember, teachers would look at the data coming in, classroom send-outs, all the punishments, all of those things that exist from the year before to get an idea of what their students are like. And I remember going through that data and it was very clear. Kid liked to cut up. And so I remember believing that and seeing that coming into the classroom. But the thing that really was impactful about her was, I remember my first week of teaching. This is my first week ever teaching. This is my first group of students. She comes up to me and she says, "Mr. Flynn." I said, "What's going on?" She said, "You're my favorite teacher." And I asked her why. I'm like, "You only know me for about 4 days. Why?" And she says, "Because you look like me." And I remember this kid who was considered a behavior challenge, who justifiably so. I saw those moments. By the end of that school year, I had an instructional coach who was outside of the building, so they weren't privy to any of that data, who pulled me aside and was like, "Do you know who the most active participant in your class is?" I said, "No, who is it?" She said, "It's her." And I know for a fact the opportunity to have a teacher who looked like her did a lot to change her relationship with school. It did a lot to take her from that girl who came in as this behavioral challenge, this disruptive student who had all of these challenges, to being one who excelled in the classroom. And that simple foundation, I don't think I was the greatest teacher in the world. I don't think I was like the most compelling lesson. I don't have any of that. But what I did have was something that allowed me to connect with her. And I think that was important to opening up a door for her being really successful in school. And so I want to spend a little time talking about our organization, Black Men Teach. The mission of Black Men Teach is to recruit, prepare, place, and retain Black male teachers in elementary school classrooms. And our vision is all students have the opportunity to attend schools staffed with racially and culturally diverse teachers and leaders reflecting the students' race, ethnicity, and culture, thereby creating an environment that affirms students for whom they are. And I just want to talk a little bit about what the work that we do looks like, and then I'm going to show you a video to kind of close out so you can actually get a chance to see what it looks like in action. So we have a high school program, and really the high school program, there's about 60 guys that we support in total. Altogether, we support just over 100 men. Where we really work with our high school students to get them to understand that teaching is a viable career. This is something that you can do. Even if you've never seen someone who looks like you do it, you can do it. We provide them opportunities to teach. We have a Saturday school that we'll run. We will bus in students to the high school, and we'll let our high school guys teach for 3 hours, lead everything. And then we provide them scholarships if they decide they want to go to college for education. Our college piece is really, at its essence, is about a strong sense of community and connectedness. We provide, again, those scholarships. All of them have mentors. We do a lot of supplemental training to make sure our men are ready to lead the classroom when they can step out of college. We provide stipends for student teaching, and then we have, as Pastor Mike shared, a partnership with the University of Minnesota for HBCU students to come here, get a fully funded master's at the University of Minnesota. We do work with career changers, so men who already have a bachelor's degree and they want to get into teaching but don't want to go back to school. We provide them with some tuition assistance, some living stipends, mentorship, additional training. And then for the men in the schools that we work with, we have a goal of having 20% of the teachers in each of the schools that we work with be Black men. So we're not just placing one and letting them go. We're placing 5, 6, 7 men. Even in Anoka Hennepin School District, we have one school partner, Monroe, where there actually are 10 Black men who are working there, 6 licensed teachers. The other 4 are either student teaching or doing an internship from our college program. We provide onboarding support. We do some school culture support, making sure that the school is an environment that's conducive to retaining our men. We do some loan forgiveness or a retention bonus if they don't have any student loan debt. We do a lot of health and wellness support. And then we even launched our first home ownership program recently. And the op-ed that I wrote, I think our first home was purchased he closed on it on the 22nd of January, and our second one was February 14th. And the last thing is just provide this ongoing network of support, instructional coaches, affinity space, and then professional development. But again, I want to show you more than I want to tell you what the work looks like. And I'll show you a video that's a little bit old. It's from our previous Brandon, but it is still my favorite video of just the work.
Before I was a teacher, I worked UPS, and I also was a football coach for many years. When I chose to transition over to teaching, it was mainly because I just saw a lot of my students not being very successful in the classroom. They were always successful on the football field, but it just wouldn't translate into the real world, the bigger picture. And that's something that I wanted to change.
Mr. White is extremely great at building relationships. He loves to interact with them, get to know them, understand how they like to learn, and that causes students to want to be in his class and to want to come to school and see what he's going to do today.
Let's make sure you got a notepad just in case you gotta take any notes.
Why I chose to become an elementary teacher is because that means that I can be impactful to my students early enough to want them to stay engaged in learning.
Black Men Teach was created because there's a need. When you have a Black teacher in a classroom, Black students benefit tremendously. We see in the long term, they're more likely to enroll in college, less likely to drop out of high school.
My students don't have to use movies and TV shows for what a Black man is supposed to be. They have me right here every day, teaching them the ropes the right way.
Student loan debt can be a huge burden that just wears on you over time. I think if we can do anything to make that easier for him, we have to do it.
Oh, okay.
You just sit down and press the be commended for his amazing hard work that he's put in the school year.
Mr. White's a great teacher because he always motivates us.
He'll help us take baby steps into making bigger leaps.
Mr. White is very funny. I mean, very funny. He's just very genuine with his students, and he's very good with us.
I can't think of someone who represents the organization better than you. But besides just telling you, I want to go ahead and show you one more thing to show you just how much you appreciate it. Mr. White.
Yep.
On behalf of Box Tops for Education and Black Men Teach, we would like to present you with this $50,000 check. This money here is to go to help you alleviate the student loan debt that you've accumulated to get to a point where you can have impact on these young kids' lives.
I do promise you guys I'm gonna be the very best teacher that I can possibly be for you guys. This was awesome. It's definitely gonna help me and my family, but it's also gonna help my students because it's just one thing that I don't have to worry about moving forward.
He's so selfless. He's clearly here to impact students and impact their lives.
I love being a teacher because I get to see growth every day. When you get to see that growth and you get to see the results of the growth, it's really an amazing feeling.
So that puts us right at time. I do want to thank you all for coming out to learn a little bit more about Black Men Teach and listen to my story. And so I don't want to keep you longer than I need to. So thank you.